So let's take a look at how the end of Reconstruction happens. In 1868, Andrew Johnson does not run for a second term. Remember, he had nearly been impeached. And so technically, Andrew Johnson never wins a presidential election. So Republicans end up nominating Ulysses S. Grant. He had zero political experience. Mostly they hoped that his reputation as a general in the war and helping win the war would lead to less partisanship within the country itself. And he ran on a platform of let us have peace. He was like, the war is over. We need to move on. Let's work together and make that happen. The Democrats end up nominating New York Governor Horatio Seymour. He had been a Copperhead. Remember, Copperhead was a congressional Democrat who wanted to make peace with the Southern whites. He depended on racial bigotry and white supremacy to attract voters to his cause, and he mostly was supported by Midwestern farmers and urban whites, and that's because he continuously said that, Easterners don't understand the working class or the farmers, and they'll, talking about the freed Africans, would be taking their jobs away. Well, Grant wins. African American support in the South played a major role in this. Federal troops protected and ensured nearly 500,000 of them could vote. Republicans also kept their large majorities in Congress. The 14th Amendment, which had been passed in July of 1868, opened the door for expansion of rights for women and minorities, but it's still going to take another 60 years before women can get the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, however, which was passed by Congress following the 1868 election, did a lot more to help minority males vote. It prohibited federal and state governments from restricting voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, meaning those who had been enslaved. It intended to prevent southern states from excluding African Americans in the political process. Democrats viewed this as a step toward equality, and so they heavily opposed it, but this is exactly what those radical Republicans were working towards. Unfortunately, it did not ensure that African Americans would have the right to hold office, and it left certain restrictions in both the North and the South that were put in place by the states themselves. Things like poll taxes, which are fees charged when people register to vote, and literacy tests, which require voters to prove they can read and write before registering. The 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870 after getting the required 3/4 of the state's approval. The unfortunate thing with Grant, he was a great military leader, but he is a very weak political leader. By 1870, more people are beginning to think less about the war and more about the future. They're really losing interest in the South, and they're losing interest in Reconstruction. Grant's experience made him incapable of dealing with the nation's problems. He really used a hands-off approach, and this makes him appear very weak in the eyes of Congress. Republicans also were losing support in the South. There were rifts within their own party, things, issues like tariffs, currency issues, the Reconstruction plans itself, and a new branch comes off the Republican Party, and they're called liberal Republicans. They're a faction of the Republican Party who favored small government, low tariffs, civil service reform, and an end to Reconstruction. Realize that by this time, we're 5 years out, and people are not seeing much progress. Kind of similar to the war. In the summer of 1869, Grant's reputation takes another hit when the first rumors of scandals within the administration and his personal life start to kind of surface. So there had been 2 speculators caught manipulating the gold market to make huge profits for themselves, to find out that it involved members of Grant's family, and people began to question his ethics. Then in the election of 1872, he is able to win again. Liberal Republicans joined forces with Democrats to nominate Horace Greeley on a platform of ending Reconstruction, but it doesn't go anywhere. September of 1872, however, right before the election, there was corruption discovered in the railroad. So Credit Mobilier, which was a construction company, that was created by directors and stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad started signing contracts with companies to work on the railroad. Then they would overcharge, passing the profits onto themselves. And so to prevent a congressional investigation, the company bribed congressional Republicans and the vice president to make sure that there was no investigation into these unlawful practices. Another scandal happens when Congress forced the Secretary of War to resign, accusing him of accepting cash gifts from Army suppliers. And so in the eyes of many, many Americans, Grant's administration is viewed as one of the worst administrations in American history. And Grant himself catches a lot of that blame, which is pretty typical for a leader, but he really doesn't deserve that much of it. He should have probably never been a president, but he was a good leader. I mean, he had good ideas. The unfortunate thing is that his administration was so corrupt that it really took the spotlight off of the good things he did under his administration. In September of 1873, the economy takes a hit again. J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy due to European stock market crash. And bad investments in the Northern Pacific Railroad leads banks and railroad businesses to begin failing. And so we see another panic hit the United States, the Panic of 1873. Again, it's a wave of economic fear. Thousands of businesses closed, people lost life savings, unemployment increases, and it's going to slide the country into a depression for about 6 years until 1879. So when the 1874 midterm elections come around the following year, the Republicans take on a lot of the blame for what's going on with the economy. And so the Democrats win back control of the House of Representatives, which would be the first time since the election of 1860. So by this point, people are really over Reconstruction. They just want to get going. The economy is not doing great. We don't have money to spend on this anymore. And also helping kind of push this end of Reconstruction, there are two very important Supreme Court cases that happened. The first is U.S. versus Cruikshanks, stemming from the 1873 Colfax Massacre, which was an incident where white supremacists killed over 100 African Americans who were protecting a courthouse where African Americans were going in to vote. The court rules that the 14th Amendment allowed the federal government to prohibit states from abusing African American civil rights, but only states could prosecute and punish the violations, not the federal government. This decision significantly weakened federal abilities to protect civil rights during Reconstruction and placed the responsibility on the states, who were often unwilling to do anything or act on it. Another case was U.S. versus Reese. This was just some clarification about what practices could be used when deciding who was eligible to vote. And so it ruled that the 15th Amendment only made it illegal to deny a citizen's voting rights based on race. States were free to use other criteria to determine voter fitness. And so this essentially paved the way for nearly a century of racial discrimination. And in the South, often it wasn't because you were black that you couldn't vote. It was because you couldn't read or write. It was because you didn't have enough money to pay the poll tax to be able to vote. Those kinds of things. It wasn't because you were black. They also did other ridiculous things, and oftentimes were able to manipulate it so that poor white people, who would have many of those same issues, illiteracy, low finances, whatever, they somehow were able to vote. But again, technically, by having poll taxes and literacy tests, they weren't denying based on race.